Every morning during the office of Paschaltide, the priest reads at prime a short passage from the epistle of St. Paul to the Colossians. He says, Si consurrexisti cum Christo, quae sursum sunt querite, ubi Christus est ad dexteram Dei sedens, quae sursum sunt sapite, non quae super terram. That is, if you be risen with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ sits at the right hand of God. Mind the things that are above, not the things that are upon the earth. In other words, if you be risen with Christ and have this new life of grace planted within you, seek the things that pertain to that life. Fish seek the things that pertain to fishy life, cats the things that pertain to the cat life, birds the things that pertain to bird life, and yet we, born a new supernatural creature by grace, fail so often to seek out or even to simply desire the things that pertain to the life of grace, the salvation of our soul. Instead, our eyes are forever trained on the earth. I think it's fair to say that in this passage, St. Paul is preaching the evangelical perfection of the 10th commandment, which God, long before the coming of Christ, had given to Moses on Sinai, and even long before that, implanted in the hearts of men by the natural law. So God gives us this preparation in the 10 commandments to get us practicing the natural law so that He can add on later, by a greater perfection, the commands of Christ. So to prepare us for this perfect seeking after heavenly things, God first teaches us how to not seek the things of the earth in an unjust way. Not only are we not supposed to take what is not ours, but we are meant not even to desire that which belongs to another. We can notice here that God doesn't just forbid us from taking things. He doesn't want to just train our actions to preserve us from external sins, but He even wants to train our desires, to train our hearts, to train our will, to preserve us even from interior sins. And He does this by the last of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. And so in our brief little look here at this commandment, we'll try to see what it is this command forbids, to see how it seeks to preserve us firstly from avarice or covetousness in general, and second, in particular, from envy. So we could read the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. In other words, we shouldn't covet goods in a disorderly way at all. So St. Thomas, he's careful though when he explains this to show that desiring things in generally is not inherently bad. If we want nothing, then we do nothing. If we don't want anything, we don't do anything at all. If I don't want lunch, I'm going to starve. Christ even tells us to ask. He says, ask and you shall receive. We see in the life of our Lord that He even rewards those who ask Him for particular favors. Just to name a few, you have the cripple at the pool of Bethsaida, and he expresses to our Lord his desire to enter the water and be cured, or our Lord obliges him by just simply curing him on the spot. Others ask Him things like, Lord, that I may see, or I believe, but help my unbelief. And so if desiring something which we didn't have were in itself inherently bad, if it were wrong full stop, then Christ wouldn't reward those desires. So again, desiring things which we don't have is not in itself something bad. But it becomes something bad, it becomes something inordinate when it offends justice, or when it goes against the law of charity. So if we want money, power, rank, some place in life different to what God has given us, if we want maybe the good opinion of others, or perhaps we even want the envy of others, and the fact that we don't have these things embitters us, then we sin against this commandment. Or if our desire for these things makes us question the plan of God, or doubt in His goodness, doubt in His providence, if we hang up our happiness on possessing them, then our desire for these things is obviously too great. It's inordinate. And this kind of desire offends against the 10th commandment. Because this kind of inordinate desire leads us to many sins, it's called a capital sin. Avarice or greed, it can lead us to the neglect of our religious duties, to our duty to tithe or to give to those in need. It can make us neglect our family because we're pursuing some job or pursuing money, or maybe it makes a child neglect living one's family life because they're too concerned, they're too covetous of the opinion of their friends or their life on the internet. Maybe even leads one to neglect his studies. But then also forbidden by this commandment is the sin of envy. So we could read it not just, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, but we could read, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. So envy is when we desire something that belongs to our neighbor because we feel like somehow his having it detracts from our happiness. It's called by St. Thomas the sadness that comes from perceiving the good of another as an injury to ourselves. He speaks about how envy in particular has a kind of special malice. It's particularly bad because it's so inherently opposed to charity. By charity, we know that we're meant to love our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. We're meant to want what is good for him. So when we see him prosper, it should be a cause of joy for us, because we would rejoice if we ourselves prospered. So when he prospers, it's something which should make us happy. Whereas envy is the exact opposite of this. And when we're envious, we're upset when we see our neighbor prosper, when we see him given something that we don't ourselves have, and we're enraged. Perhaps maybe we think he doesn't deserve it, or maybe that we deserve it in some particular way. And this is a sin which I think, because it's so petty, we never want to recognize in ourselves. And yet it's a sin which we see is very clearly and even deeply rooted in our fallen human nature when we look at children. You can enkindle the deadly ire of a 2-year-old by cooing at a baby doll instead of giving the child attention. He comes up, grabs the baby doll, and throws it on the floor. It's enraged that it's not getting attention. Even when we think of sibling rivalry between boys or something like that. Not that rivalry is not good, but it makes us imitate good or pursue some good object. Well, then it is good. But when it's something that just makes us mad because we see somebody else has something that we don't have, well, then that's envy. If we understand that Christ summed up the entirety of the commandments in the law of charity, to love God above all things and our neighbor as ourselves, then we ought to be able to see and understand just how deep that particular malice of envy is. If envy is opposed to charity, then it's something which eats away at the very essence, the very foundation of our spiritual life. Charity, we know, St. Paul says, it does not puff up, but it edifies. It gives our spiritual life its structural strength. Envy, then, being opposed to charity, is something which weakens our spiritual life. Because it focuses us on ourselves, it prevents us from that perfect seeking out of the things of God which St. Paul mentions. It eats away at the core of our spiritual life. We might conclude with a quote from Proverbs, which I think aptly sums this up. We read, "Soundness of heart is the life of the flesh, but envy is the rottenness of the bones."